Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to share how I bloom my Dendrobium orchids. So I have a bunch of them. I have Australian type Dendrobiums. I have Dendrobium phalaenopsis types. I have Dendrobium nobile types as well. I'm going to give you guys a couple of practical tips and tricks so you guys can bloom these orchids like I have. I grow everything indoors under LED lights. I'm going to give you tips on how to grow them. If you are using a windowsill, if you are growing under LED lights, it really doesn't matter. There are some simple tips and tricks that you can use to get them to bloom. Now it is 90 degrees in this room, so I'm gonna step out and show you my Dendrobiums and run through these tips. All right, much better. It's a lot cooler in my living room, but with that said, there's a car blasting music outside, so I hope you can hear me well and you're not too distracted by the outside noise. So Dendrobium orchids, how do we get them to bloom? Well, I have a couple of tips for you. Now, this applies to any Dendrobium phalaenopsis orchid, Dendrobium nobile orchid as well. That one has specific care. And then any Australian Dendrobiums as well, I would say that this applies for. There are lots of Dendrobiums out there, so just a disclaimer, if you have something that looks a little different like this is a Dendrobium jenkensii, you would have to look up the specific care for that. If it doesn't look like a typical Dendrobium phalaenopsis or nobile orchid, I would look up the specific care. This one's a Dendrobium aggregatum. So with that out of the way, let's get into the tips on how to get these orchids to bloom. Okay. The first tip, and this was very important in my Cattleya video, it's light. These orchids need bright, indirect light. I really like a south-facing window with filtered light. That works perfectly for these orchids, but in order to get them to bloom, they need sufficient light. If you are in the southern hemisphere, it is the opposite. You would want a north-facing window. I think also an east-facing window can work well. I don't think you have to filter that, but if you do anything west-facing, you would have to filter that light, and then anything north-facing in the northern hemisphere wouldn't work too well. It wouldn't be enough light. I grow my orchids under LED lights. That works really well. I keep the Dendrobiums maybe within a foot off the top of the leaves, and I'm able to get them to bloom successfully. So light is super important in getting Dendrobiums to bloom. Okay, the next tip are the temperatures. So most Dendrobiums prefer temperatures between 60 and 85 degrees. Some of them like it even warmer. So I'm talking about these Dendrobium phalaenopsis orchids. This one is my Dendrobium New Hope Mini here. Now, Dendrobium phalaenopsis love to be warm. My grow room right now is 90 degrees and these love it. Some of them really like it hot, but I'd say 60 to 85 degrees is optimal. You don't want it to get below 60 degrees, with the exception of the Dendrobium nobile orchids, and we'll get into that specific here shortly. But these orchids like to be nice and warm generally, and then they need a temperature drop at night of at least 10 degrees. So they need a differential between night and day. Now I give these to my orchids naturally because I grow under lights, and when the lights get turned off, the temperatures drop automatically, and I also open up a window. So that's how they get the temperature drop. If you're growing outdoors and you live in a tropical environment, that happens naturally at night. I mean, after all, these orchids, this is what they get at night. They get cooler temperatures at night, so you're pretty much mimicking what they get in the wild, and that usually triggers them to bloom. So light and temperature, making sure they get a night-day temperature differential is perfect, and these are my two top most important tips on how to get Dendrobiums to bloom. The next tip is watering. So you want to water these orchids very thoroughly. I have most of these. Wow, I just repotted this not too long ago and it's already growing through the bottom. I have this orchid in moss and bark. And what I do is I water thoroughly, I let it drain, and then I put it back in the decorative pot. You don't want these orchids sitting in water. So if you have a decorative pot, you want to make sure that there's not water in the bottom, or that can promote roots that are rotting. So I like to water thoroughly, let it drain, make sure there's no water in the decorative pot, and then you're good. You let it dry. I water these orchids when they dry. So depending on the size of the pot, that could be once a week, it could be 2 times a week. Generally, if the pot is very small, it's 2 times a week. If it's a really big pot, then it's 1 time per week. But I grow most of them in bark and some moss. This one has a lot more bark in it. This is about 70% bark, 30% sphagnum moss, and every 2 weeks, every 2 times a week is pretty good for this orchid, but never let them sit in water. Okay, the next tip, it ties along with water, is fertilization. So you want to use a good orchid fertilizer in order to get these orchids to bloom. And I like to use fertilizer between the spring and summer months when they're actively growing. I use MSU fertilizer. I use half strength every single week, and that's how I feed these orchids when I water them. You want to fertilize regularly when they're growing so that they give you nice strong growth structures, and that helps with the blooming later on. Okay, the next tip is not as important as the first few, but the next tip is humidity. So dendrobiums like it humid. So they like humidity between 50 and 70%. My humidity is about 40% indoors. I don't find that they have too many issues, but if you have higher humidity, it kind of helps, because Dendrobium phalaenopsis orchids in particular, they're very prone to spider mites. You'll see this one has a little bit of spider mite damage. So if it's really dry, you have to watch out for spider mites. If it's more humid, I find that the spider mites are more at bay. But if you are able to get your humidity up, it's kind of like a nice little thing that they can have. They don't have to have it, but it helps them as well. It's not the most important thing, but it's just something to keep in the back of your mind. If you could give it to them, it'll be amazing. If you can't give it to them, they'll probably still be able to bloom. But you could also mist. So this tip is not super important. It's just like a nice to have. Okay, the next tip is a rest period. So some of these orchids are evergreen and they grow all year round. So I'm talking about these Denphals. They grow all year round. They don't stop growing, but there are some others. I find that this one grows all year round as well. It's constantly pushing growths. It slows down, but it constantly is pushing new growths. The Dendrobium nobile orchids, on the other hand, they have a rest period that they need. So when they stop growing, they need to be, you have to stop watering them. And I find that these prefer a cooler temperature in the winter. Now these orchids can go all the way down to just above freezing, and they're totally fine. And you could check out this video here if you want specific Dendrobium nobile care. But if an orchid requires rest, you do have to stop watering, you have to stop fertilizing. If it's like a Dendrobium phalaenopsis or an Aussie Den, you don't have to give it a rest period, but you do taper back on the fertilizer in the winter. Maybe give quarter strength or stop altogether. You can give it a little break, but make sure that when you're starting to see active growths pushing, you are giving it some sort of fertilizer to grow. But with the Dendrobium nobile orchid, it stops altogether, and it does require that cooler temperature. So check out that link to learn more about the specific care for that orchid. Okay, this is a very quick video. I just want to share all these tips that I have for you, but the next thing that I'm going to say is you just need to have patience. So whenever you get an orchid, sometimes it takes a year to acclimate to your environment. I grow everything in a grow room indoors, and it's quite hot in there in the summer. It's a little bit drier than a greenhouse, a lot drier than a greenhouse. So sometimes it just takes a while, especially if you're repotting these orchids, you're putting it in a different media that you prefer. Sometimes it could take a year for it to acclimate. So you just have to be patient. Make sure that it's getting good light but not scorching the leaves. Make sure you're fertilizing. Make sure you're watering but not rotting the roots. I know it sounds like a lot, but as long as you have the right potting mix and the right light conditions, you should be fine in getting these orchids to bloom. But you do have to wait a while, so it's not going to be one of those things that is going to happen really, really fast. It does take some patience. Don't be surprised if a new orchid takes a year. That's an extreme case, but sometimes it'll take a couple of months if it's a mature orchid to acclimate to your environment. But if you've had it for a while, that's when you'll really start to see the blooms coming in. Something I'll say about Dendrobium orchids is that they're all a little bit different. I find that the Dendrobium phalaenopsis orchids, they like it quite warm to hot. They don't like it when it gets cold. I have friends in Florida that grow them outdoors, and they don't do great when the temperatures go low. So that's why they prefer the nobile orchids that tolerate the cooler temps. So that's just for the Dendrobium phalaenopsis types. If it's warm, hot, they love it. But some of the others, they can tolerate cooler temperatures. So like the Australian Dendrobiums, they're super, they tolerate a lot of different kinds of temperatures, which is amazing. So this right here could go to just above freezing, which is awesome. So that's just something to keep in mind. This one is a Kingianum hybrid, and this one can be grown in a variety of different temperatures, which is fantastic. I hope this helped. I find Dendrobiums really easy to grow. The Dendrobium phalaenopsis, they tend to bloom very often. They give you sprays of beautiful flowers. Some are fragrant, some are not fragrant. The nobiles are fragrant. The nobiles are a little bit more in terms of care, because you do have to pay attention to when to stop watering them, and that's usually when they're done growing, and then you have to give them a cooler rest period. If you grow them outside, that happens naturally, but if you grow them indoors, it could be a little tricky. I put mine out on my fire escape, and that does the job, but those are a little bit tougher to bloom, but they're super common. So if you grow them outdoors, you're good, but if you grow them inside, you just have to do a little bit more. So that's why I prefer the Aussie Dens and the Dendrobium phalaenopsis orchids. Easy to bloom. Follow these tips and you'll be able to get them to bloom in no time. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye everyone.